This week, as this is being made, Texas is in the grip of another brutal heat wave, and something happened on the state's power grid that has now become an almost annual ritual. Electricity demand shattered its all-time record. On a triple-digit afternoon, with the thermometer hitting 106 degrees in Austin, Texans turned up their air conditioning all at once. And the grid operator watched demand climb past 91,000 megawatts, blowing past the previous record set just 2 summers ago. And here is the thing to understand about that number. It is not a freak. It is a pattern. Because in Texas, the record keeps breaking. Almost every summer, the grid is asked to do more than it has ever done before. Because almost every summer is hotter than the last. That is the story of this series. Not a single heat wave, and not a single disaster. It is about the fact that Texas is facing a heat crisis that is genuinely, measurably getting worse every single summer. And that this crisis is not one problem, but a whole stack of them, layered on top of one another, each one making the others more dangerous. There is so much to it that we're going to take it in 3 parts. In this first part, we'll lay the foundation, the hard data on how fast it's getting worse, the science of how heat actually kills a human body, and the strange, fragile, self-imposed independence of the Texas power grid, including the winter it very nearly died. In the second part, we'll go to where most Texans actually live, the cities that manufacture their own heat, and to the water crisis that shadows all of it. And in the third, we'll look at the compound disasters, the economics, and the brutal question of who in the end actually pays. Because Texas is not just hot. Texas is a place where more than 30 million people live in one of the hottest parts of the country, on their own separate and isolated electrical grid, in a state where tens of thousands of prisoners sit in cells with no air conditioning at all, where outdoor workers have had their legal right to a water break stripped away, and where a single hurricane can knock out the power to millions and leave them to face that heat with no way to cool down. So settle in, because once you see how all of these pressures stack, you understand why Texas, more than almost anywhere in America, is where our hotter future is arriving first, and at the largest scale. Start with the trend itself, because the phrase getting worse every summer is not a figure of speech. It is what the data shows. In 2023, Texas endured its hottest full year in recorded history, and it was also, not coincidentally, the deadliest. Depending on exactly how you count, somewhere between 330 and more than 560 people died from heat in Texas that year. The most since the state began keeping track in 1989. And even those numbers are almost certainly an undercount, because heat is a slippery killer. It rarely shows up on a death certificate as the single cause. It pushes a weak heart or a failing kidney over the edge days later and gets recorded as something else. When researchers instead look at excess deaths, the number of people who died beyond what you would expect in a normal summer, the estimates for 2023 climb toward 1,000. Nationally, the pattern is the same. Annual heat deaths in the United States more than doubled between 1999 and 2023, from around 1,000 a year to well over 2,000. Then came 2024, which became the warmest year on record in Texas, overtaking 2023. And the projections for what comes next are genuinely staggering. The Texas state climatologist has projected that the number of 100-degree days the state experiences will nearly double by the year 2036, compared to the first 2 decades of this century. Let that sink in. Not double by the end of the century. Double within about a decade. His report put it in a way that is hard to forget. It means a typical average year around 2036 would be hotter than all, but the very hottest, most extreme year Texas experienced in the entire period from 1895 to 2020. The freak year of the past becomes the normal year of the near future. And it is not just the daytime highs. One of the most important and least understood parts of this is that the nights are warming even faster than the days. A hot day is survivable if the night cools off enough to let your body and your city recover. But across Texas, the overnight lows are climbing, so that recovery window is shrinking. As one El Paso official put it, watching heat deaths rise year after year. What they are realizing now is that it is no longer just the vulnerable who are at risk. It's everybody. Heat, as one NOAA scientist bluntly said, doesn't care. So before we go further, it's worth understanding exactly why heat kills, because it is not as obvious as it sounds, and it explains almost everything that follows. Your body runs at about 98.6 degrees, and it fights hard to hold that temperature. On a hot day, it sheds heat in a few ways, but once the air around you climbs past your skin temperature, which is around 95 degrees, most of those methods stop working. The air is no longer pulling heat out of you, it is pushing heat in. And you are left with essentially one tool: sweat. You perspire. The sweat evaporates off your skin, and evaporation carries heat away. That tool has one absolute requirement, and it is dryness. Sweat only cools you if the air is dry enough to let it evaporate. And this is why humidity is so deadly, and why Texas is such a dangerous place. Because much of it is not dry. In the eastern half of the state, along the Gulf, the air is thick with moisture blowing off warm water, so a person's sweat cannot evaporate. It just runs off, useless. This is measured by something called the heat index, or the feels-like temperature, which combines the heat and the humidity into a single number that reflects what the heat actually does to a body. In Houston, with summer humidity averaging around 65%, a 92-degree afternoon can feel like 112. And in West Texas, the heat is drier, which sounds safer, but the dry air pulls water out of a body at an astonishing rate, so dehydration becomes the killer instead. Either way, the endpoint is the same. When the body can no longer shed heat, the core temperature climbs. The heart races to circulate blood to the skin, blood pressure drops, and the organs begin to fail. It can happen in hours. And it is happening every summer to more and more Texans. Now let's look at the first of the systems straining under that heat, the one Texas is uniquely, self-inflictedly exposed on. The power grid. Here is a fact that surprises a lot of people. Texas is the only state in the continental United States that runs on its own, largely isolated electrical grid. Most of the country is tied together into two enormous interconnected networks, the Eastern and the Western, which lets states share power across huge distances when one region runs short. Texas deliberately stayed out of both. Its grid, run by an operator called ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, was kept separate specifically so that it would not cross state lines, and therefore would not fall under federal regulation. It is a genuine point of Texas pride, this electrical independence, a physical expression of the state's whole political identity. But it is also the state's Achilles heel, because when Texas runs short of power, it cannot easily borrow much from its neighbors. It is an island, and an island has to survive on its own, no matter what the weather does. And in February of 2021, the weather did something catastrophic, and it exposed exactly how fragile that island really is. That month, Winter Storm Uri pushed a mass of Arctic air deep into Texas, dropping temperatures in San Antonio to 6 degrees below zero, in a city where the winter lows rarely fall below the 40s. Demand for heating spiked toward what would have been an all-time record. And then, all at once, the grid began to fail. Power plants, and above all, the natural gas system that fuels most of them, froze up. Gas wellheads iced over. Pipelines lost pressure. According to the federal investigation that followed, natural gas fuel supply problems caused the overwhelming majority of the outages, around 87% of them. Gas production in the state dropped by nearly half at the exact moment demand for it peaked. And here was the vicious loop at the heart of it. The blackouts themselves knocked out power to the gas infrastructure, which cut the gas supply, which forced still more power plants offline. Nearly half of all the generating capacity in the entire state, up to 48%, every type of plant, went dark. The grid operator was, by its own later account, minutes away from a complete, uncontrolled collapse. The kind that could have physically damaged the system and left the whole state without power not for days, but for weeks or months. To prevent that, they did the only thing they could. They ordered rolling blackouts, cutting power to millions of people on purpose. It became the largest manually controlled power shutoff in American history. At its peak, 4.5 million homes and businesses lost power. 69% of all Texans lost electricity at some point, for an average of 42 hours, and many for 4 or 5 straight days. And because the water treatment plants also lost power, nearly half of all Texans lost safe running water too, as pipes burst in millions of unwinterized homes. People died in the cold and the dark, in a state that had assumed this could never happen to it. The official state death toll was 246, though a number of independent analyses, including work drawing on federal data, concluded the true figure was likely more than 700. Most of the dead were elderly. Nearly 60% were 60 or older. They died of hypothermia in unheated homes, of carbon monoxide poisoning as they tried desperately to heat those homes with grills and cars, of medical equipment going silent. There was a woman in the Houston suburb of Humble whose son was paralyzed from the waist down and depended on a feeding device that needed electricity. For 5 days she had none, and she said in an interview afterward that she was afraid she was going to lose her son. That was the fear in millions of homes at once. And then, when it was over, came the bill, in the most literal sense. The Texas electricity market is deregulated, built in the 1990s around competition rather than a central utility. And it has a rule that lets the wholesale price of power soar during shortages, all the way up to a cap of $9,000 per megawatt hour, roughly 100 times the normal price. During Uri, the price was pinned at that cap, and the grid operator kept it there, by its regulator's own later admission, for about 2 days longer than it should have, after the emergency had largely passed, overcharging the market by an estimated $16 billion. Some electricity retailers went bankrupt. Some customers on variable rate plans opened their bills to find they owed thousands of dollars for a single week of power they had barely been able to use. The total economic damage from the storm was estimated in the range of $80 to over $130 billion, and by some accounts far higher, making it the costliest disaster in the history of the state. The aftermath exposed something uncomfortable. The regulator that oversaw the grid had just months before the storm eliminated its own oversight and enforcement division and cut ties with an independent monitor of grid reliability. The generators had been warned, after previous cold snaps in 2011 and even 1989, that they needed to weatherize their equipment against the cold, and most had not, because in a competitive market with no requirement to do so, weatherproofing was a cost with no reward. 7 members of the grid operators board resigned. The legislature passed a law requiring power plants and parts of the gas supply chain to finally weatherize. But critics point out that significant portions of the gas system were effectively exempted, and the deeper design of the market was left largely intact. So the lesson of Uri hangs over every season now. The grid is an island, the island is fragile, and when it fails. In the cold or in the heat, it is the most vulnerable people who die in the extreme temperature it was supposed to hold back. It was a winter catastrophe. But every summer, the heat now tests that same fragile system in reverse. Look at the trajectory. In 2019, peak summer demand on the Texas grid was around 75,000 megawatts. By August of 2023, during a savage summer that pushed the grid to the brink of rolling blackouts more than once, It hit an all-time record of about 85,500. And this week, in the summer of 2026, it shattered even that, climbing past 91,000 megawatts, with the grid operator predicting demand could top 92,000 before the season is out. Every summer, a new ceiling. Because every summer, more heat and more people and more air conditioning running for more hours of the day and night. Now, here is where I have to be fair and honest, because the story is not simply one of impending collapse. And you deserve the accurate version. This summer, unlike in 2023, the grid held, comfortably. And it held for a specific and genuinely impressive reason. Texas has quietly become the national leader in building two things: solar power and giant banks of batteries. On the hottest afternoons now, solar panels across West Texas are generating enormous amounts of power exactly when demand for cooling peaks, and those batteries store it and release it in the early evening as the sun goes down but the heat lingers. During this week's record demand, solar was producing over 34,000 megawatts at its peak, and batteries were discharging nearly 12,000. The grid operator did not even have to ask people to conserve. So the honest truth is that renewables and batteries have, so far, kept pace with the rising summer heat and made the grid more reliable, not less. That deserves to be said plainly, especially because it runs against the political grain in Texas, where lawmakers have repeatedly tried, and so far failed, to pass bills restricting the very solar and battery industry that is currently saving their grid. But the pressure is not going away. It is just shifting, and shifting toward the grid's weakest point. Remember those warming nights. As the overnight temperatures stay high, cooling demand is spreading later into the night, into the hours after the sun has set and solar power has vanished from the grid, when the state leans hardest on those batteries and on natural gas. That is the new frontier of risk. On top of that, Texas is being flooded with enormous new electricity users, especially the data centers that power artificial intelligence, which want to plug into the grid in staggering quantities. The queue of large new power requests waiting to connect has swelled into the hundreds of thousands of megawatts, more than the entire grid's current capacity. So the grid is being asked to serve more heat, more people, and more machines, and to do it later into the night, every single year. It has kept up so far. The question that hangs over every Texas summer is whether it will keep keeping up. So that is the foundation. A state getting measurably hotter every year, a heat that kills through a simple and unforgiving physiology, and a proud, isolated, fragile electrical grid that has already failed catastrophically once and is being asked to do more each summer than it has ever done. But a grid is an abstraction until you go to where people actually live and feel the heat on their skin. And that is where we're going in part 2, into the great Texas cities that don't just suffer the heat, but actively manufacture it, and into the slow-motion water crisis that shadows every hot summer. Because the heat and the drought, it turns out, are two faces of the same coin. In the first part, we saw the shape of the crisis from above, a state getting measurably hotter every year, and a proud, isolated, fragile power grid straining to keep the air conditioning running. But a grid is an abstraction. So now let's go down to the ground, to where most Texans actually experience this heat, which is in their cities. Because Texas is a deeply urban state, and its great cities are not just passively hot. They actively manufacture heat through a phenomenon called the urban heat island effect. Here is how it works. A city is built of materials, asphalt, concrete, brick, dark rooftops that are extraordinarily good at absorbing the sun's energy during the day and then radiating it back out as heat, long into the night. A parking lot or a highway can be dozens of degrees, hotter than a grassy field beside it. Pack a whole metropolis full of those surfaces, strip out the trees, and add the waste heat of millions of cars and air conditioners, and the city becomes measurably, dangerously hotter than the countryside around it. And Texas has some of the worst of it in the nation. In one major analysis by the nonprofit Climate Central, 4 Texas cities landed in the top 10 in the country for the intensity of their heat island. Houston ranked second in the entire United States, Dallas 4th, San Antonio 6th, and Austin 10th. In parts of these cities, the built environment alone adds 8, 9, even more degrees on top of whatever the regional temperature is. Take them one at a time, because each has its own flavor of the crisis. Houston is the humidity capital. Its raw thermometer readings are almost moderate by Texas standards, but with summer humidity averaging around 65%, the heat index tells the real story, and Houston endures more days where the heat index climbs above 110 degrees than any other major city in America. When residents mapped the temperature across Houston and surrounding Harris County on a single summer day, they found a gradient of more than 17 degrees between the coolest, leafiest areas and the hottest stretches of pavement. Dallas and its twin, Fort Worth, sprawl across more than 7,000 square miles of development, forming one of the most intense heat islands in the country. In the brutal drought summer of 2011, Dallas hit 100 degrees on 71 consecutive days. In 2024, it broke 100 degrees 23 times and topped out at 107. And when the city mapped its own neighborhoods, it found that on a day, the official temperature read 101, the leafy. Wealthy parts of town were as much as 12 degrees cooler than the hottest, most paved over neighborhoods. Some Dallas neighborhoods sit in the low 70s at 6 in the morning, while others start the day already above 82. San Antonio sits at a brutal boundary, where the dry heat of West Texas collides with the wet heat of the Gulf, giving it, in the words of one analysis, the worst of both worlds. In 2024, its hottest year on record, the heat index reached 117 degrees, an all-time high, and 100-degree days there are now roughly 3 times more common than they were 30 years ago. And Austin, the booming capital, has nearly tripled its population since 1990, paving over the hill country ranchland around it and building its own heat island in the process. And here is the part of the city story that matters most, the part that connects to everything else in this series. That heat is not shared equally within a city. Study after study, in Dallas and San Antonio, across the country, has found the same brutal pattern. The hottest neighborhoods are overwhelmingly the poorest ones, and very often the ones that were, decades ago, deliberately segregated and denied investment. Wealthy neighborhoods have mature trees, parks, and shade. Poor neighborhoods have pavement, fewer trees, and older housing with weaker or no air conditioning. So within a single Texas city, on a single afternoon, 2 people can be living in temperatures 10 or 12 degrees apart, and it is almost never the wealthier person on the hotter side of that line. The map of urban heat is, to a striking degree, the map of who has money and who does not. Now let's turn to the crisis that shadows the heat, that is caused by the same climate forces and makes everything harder: water. Because heat and drought in Texas are 2 faces of the same coin, and the state has already lived through a preview of where this goes. That preview was 2011, the driest year in the recorded history of Texas. Rainfall that year was only about 40% of normal, and the state's rivers ran at their lowest levels since records began in 1895. And the damage was staggering. Between February and September of that year, according to a study using NASA satellite data, the total amount of water stored across the entire state in its soils, aquifers, lakes, and reservoirs dropped by more than 50 million acre-feet, an almost unimaginable volume, nearly enough water to fill Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the country, twice over. Reservoirs that supply major cities dropped toward 1/3 of their capacity. Hundreds of towns imposed mandatory water restrictions, and at least one small community's water supply ran completely dry, forcing it to truck water in. The Texas Forest Service estimated that 5.5 million trees died in the state's towns and cities that year alone, from the heat and the lack of water, and the economic blow was historic. The 2011 drought caused an estimated $7.6 billion in direct losses to Texas agriculture, the costliest single-year drought in the state's history, and possibly the most expensive ever suffered by any American state. Texas is the nation's largest producer of both cattle and cotton, and the drought gutted both. Livestock producers lost over $3 billion as they were forced to sell off herds they could not water, and cotton growers lost more than $2 billion. But 2011 was a single dry year. The deeper, slower water crisis is happening underground, and it is permanent in a way a drought is not. Because much of Texas, especially its farms, drinks from ancient underground aquifers, and those aquifers are being drained far faster than nature can ever refill them. The largest is the Ogallala, which lies beneath the Panhandle and West Texas and stretches up through 8 states. It is the biggest aquifer in the country, and it is the lifeblood of High Plains agriculture, some of the most productive farmland on Earth. And it is being pumped, according to one Texas State University analysis, about 6.5 times faster than it is being recharged. In some places, water levels have already dropped more than 200 feet since large-scale irrigation began. In parts of the Panhandle, it can now take a week to pump a single inch of water. And farmers are being forced to drill ever deeper for water that comes up slower and dirtier. Some counties around Amarillo and Lubbock are projected to be effectively out of groundwater in as little as 15 years. Meanwhile, the Edwards Aquifer, which supplies drinking water to San Antonio and the Hill Country, is under its own relentless pressure from a growing population. Part of what is driving this is a piece of law from another era, a century-old Texas doctrine called the rule of capture. It is brutally simple. If you own the land above an aquifer, the water beneath it is yours, and you can pump as much as you want. If your neighbor pumps more and drains your well, that is simply your bad luck. Economists call this a tragedy of the commons, and it has no brake built into it. Each landowner, acting rationally in their own interest, helps drain the shared bank account for everyone. The state's own water plan, sober and official, projects that Texas's total water supply will fall by roughly 18% by 2070, with groundwater specifically declining by around a third. Even as the state's population is projected to swell past 46 million people, and by around 2060, for the first time, the water demand of the cities is projected to overtake the demand of agriculture, as thirsty, growing metros outbid farmers for a shrinking supply. So the heat and the water crisis feed each other in a closing loop. The hotter it gets, the more water everyone needs. And the faster the aquifers empty, and the emptier they get, the less margin the state has for the next brutal, hot, dry summer. Every record-breaking hot year is also, quietly, a withdrawal from a bank account that is not being refilled. Now let's turn to the piece of this crisis that is the hardest to hear, and the clearest example of heat as a human choice rather than just weather. The prisons. Most prisons in Texas do not have air conditioning. Not some. Most. There are roughly 134,000 people incarcerated in the Texas prison system, and the majority of them live, through these record-breaking summers, in cells with no cooling at all. Inside those concrete buildings, in the Texas summer, temperatures have been recorded routinely climbing past 100 degrees, and in some cases well past 110. One inmate's cell was recorded at 112 degrees. People describe conditions that are genuinely hard to read about. Inmates flooding their own cells with water from the toilet and lying down in it, on the concrete floor, just to pull their body temperature down a few degrees. And people die. A study published in a major medical journal estimated that roughly 13% of all deaths in Texas prisons during the warm months, over an 18-year period, may have been attributable to extreme heat days. This is not a fringe claim from activists. In March of 2025, a federal judge ruled directly on it, finding that housing Texas inmates in these sweltering, unair-conditioned facilities is, in his exact words, plainly unconstitutional. He wrote that all of those roughly 134,000 people face a substantial risk of serious harm from the extreme heat. He found the prison system's own mitigation measures, the respite areas, and the water and the ice, to be inadequate and arbitrarily applied. Noting that only about 10% of inmates even qualify for heat sensitivity protections, while everyone housed in an unair-conditioned building is in danger, including, in one example he cited, a 90-year-old with high blood pressure who would not have qualified. Now here is what makes this the sharpest example in the entire story of heat as a policy choice, rather than simply weather. Installing air conditioning across the whole prison system would cost, by the state's own estimate, a bit over $1 billion, with an annual operating cost of around $20 million. Texas, in recent years, has been sitting on a state budget surplus of tens of billions of dollars, at one point around $33 billion. As one state representative put it bluntly, they had the resources, they just didn't have the will. Bills to require the prisons to be kept at a safe temperature have been introduced session after session and have repeatedly failed to pass. The state has slowly been adding some cooling, but nowhere near enough to cool the whole system. And so a federal trial began in 2026 over whether the entire prison system must be air-conditioned by the end of the decade. Here, in the prisons, the crisis is at its most naked. The heat is deadly. The fix is known and available, the money exists, and the people affected are among the least able to advocate for themselves. Whether they live or die in a Texas summer is, quite literally, a question of political will. And it is not only prisoners who have been left exposed by policy. The next piece of this is about the people who physically build Texas and pave its roads and tend its yards out in the open in that record heat. The outdoor workers. Texas has no statewide law requiring that outdoor workers be given water breaks, rest breaks, or shade in extreme heat. None. For years, a few of the state's big cities filled that gap themselves. Austin, back in 2010, and Dallas in 2015 passed local ordinances requiring that construction workers be given a rest and water break every few hours in the heat. It was a minimal floor of protection, 10 minutes in the shade with water, but it was something, and advocates say that where such rules exist, employers tend to provide more breaks even beyond what is required. Then, in 2023, the Texas legislature passed, and the governor signed a sweeping law, officially House Bill 2127, that opponents nicknamed the Death Star Bill. Its purpose was to strip cities and counties of the power to pass or enforce local regulations that go beyond state law across huge swaths of public life. And one of the things it wiped out, in the middle of one of the hottest summers on record, was those local water break ordinances. Just like that, the floor was gone. The people this falls on hardest are often migrant and Spanish-speaking laborers, on construction sites and lawn crews, for whom a language barrier or an uncertain immigration status can make it almost impossible to demand a break, or to report it safely when the heat makes them sick. Their heat illnesses go undocumented and uncounted. Advocates and workers who protested the law in the streets of Houston called it simply the law that kills. And the toll is real, if hard to fully measure. Across the country, at least several hundred workers died from environmental heat exposure on the job over the last decade for which we have data, a figure that everyone in the field agrees is a significant undercount. In Texas, there are stories like that of a 51-year-old landscaper who fainted at work on a hot day and died, leaving behind a family he had been supporting. Supporters of the Death Star bill argue that it simply creates useful regulatory consistency and that worker safety is already the domain of federal rules. But there is still no enforceable federal heat standard for workers in effect. And so, in practice, across much of Texas, whether a worker gets water and shade on a 115-degree day now comes down to the individual goodwill of the individual employer. As one construction worker put it, simply and chillingly, bosses change. So this is the shape of the crisis on the ground. Cities that manufacture their own heat and distribute it along the old lines of wealth and segregation. A water supply being quietly permanently drained beneath the surface, and two groups of people, prisoners and outdoor workers, for whom the state has specifically chosen not to guarantee the one thing that keeps a person alive in this heat. But there is one more danger we haven't touched, the one that turns an ordinary summer into a mass casualty event overnight. It is what happens when the heat collides with another disaster at the same time. And that, along with the economics of who pays for all of this, is where we're going in part 3. In the first 2 parts, we built the picture, a state getting hotter every year. A fragile, isolated grid, cities that manufacture their own heat, a water supply draining underground, and prisoners and workers the state has chosen to leave exposed. Now let's look at what happens when the heat collides with another disaster at the same time. Because this is where Texas offers a genuine, terrifying preview of the future, and it is not hypothetical. It has already happened. Call it the compound catastrophe. In July of 2024, Hurricane Beryl made landfall in Texas and passed almost directly over Houston, the 4th largest city in America. It was only a Category 1 hurricane, on the weaker end of the scale, the kind of storm a big coastal city is supposed to shrug off. But it knocked out electricity to nearly 3 million homes and businesses, around 80% of the customers of the region's main utility. And then, in the days that followed, the power stayed out. For some, it was out for a day or two. For many, it was out for more than a week. Restoration was slow and chaotic, and the utility came under withering criticism, in part because its own online outage map didn't even work in the crucial early days. Residents were reduced to tracking the blackouts using, of all things, the mobile app for a fast food burger chain, because it happened to show which of its locations still had power and which were dark. And into that darkness came the heat. In the days after Beryl passed, the Texas summer returned with full force, heat indexes climbing back to 100 degrees. And millions of people had no way to run their air conditioning. This is the exact scenario that public health experts fear most, and it played out in real time across America's 4th largest city. The death toll from Beryl in Texas climbed to at least 36 people, and more than half of those deaths were not from the storm's wind or its water at all. They were from the heat during the prolonged power outage. People died in their own homes, in the dark, because the machine that was keeping them alive had no electricity. One of them was a 64-year-old woman who used a wheelchair and relied on a feeding tube. Her sister did everything she could think of to keep her cool, but on the 4th day, without power. She woke to find her sister struggling to breathe, and she died, and the medical examiner ruled the cause as heat. This is the lesson Beryl teaches, and it may be the single most important key to understanding the whole Texas heat crisis. In a place where survival through the summer depends entirely on air conditioning, you do not need a record-shattering heat wave to produce a mass casualty event. You just need ordinary summer heat plus a failure of the power. And Texas is a place that gets both hurricanes and heat at the same time of year, every year. That combination, the compound disaster, the storm that takes the power, and the heat that fills the vacuum, is arguably the single greatest heat threat the state faces. And with an aging grid, intensifying storms in a warming Gulf, and more people than ever depending on cooling, it is not a question of whether it happens again, but when. And that compounding danger points to something most people never connect to the heat at all: its enormous and rapidly rising financial cost. Because the same warming climate that drives the heat also intensifies the hurricanes, the hailstorms, the floods, and even the freezes, and all of that is now showing up for ordinary Texans on a single bill: their home insurance. Texas suffers more billion-dollar weather disasters than any other state in the country, and the insurance market has been reacting accordingly. For most of the last decade, home insurance rates in Texas rose by low single digits a year. Then came the disasters. Rates jumped by around 11% in 2022, then by roughly 21% in 2023, then by about 19% in 2024. The result is that the median Texas homeowner was paying around 60% more for insurance in 2024 than they were in 2019, double the national rate of increase. And Texas has become one of the most expensive states in the country to insure a home, with average premiums in some coastal, hurricane-exposed areas running well over $6,000 a year. This is the quiet, grinding, economic face of the crisis, and it reaches even people who never file a claim. Because insurers now price the whole region's rising risk into everyone's premium. It has become one of the top political concerns in the state. In one poll, home insurance affordability ranked as voters' second most important issue, with nearly 80% saying their premiums had risen in the past 5 years. And here is why it bites so deep. You cannot get a mortgage without insurance. So as the climate makes Texas more disaster-prone and insurance more expensive, the basic financial arithmetic of owning a home in Texas, long one of the state's great selling points, gets harder, especially for the people with the least cushion. The heat and the wilder weather that comes with it is slowly repricing the entire state. So who, in the end, is actually paying the highest price in all of this? In bodies rather than dollars? Because the heat, as we have seen again and again throughout this series, does not fall evenly. It has a clear and consistent pattern about whom it kills. It kills the poor, who cannot afford to run the air conditioning even when they have a working unit, or whose old units break down at the worst moment. It kills the elderly, whose bodies regulate temperature poorly, and who so often live alone, unnoticed, until it is too late. Recall that nearly 60% of the dead in Winter Storm Uri were over 60. It kills the unhoused, who have no cooled space to retreat to at all, and who have died under highway overpasses after 50 straight days of triple-digit heat. It kills the outdoor workers, out in the full sun with no relief mandated by any law. And in Texas, uniquely among American states, it kills migrants in large numbers. Far out in the west, the border runs through the Chihuahuan Desert, one of the most punishing landscapes in North America. And people attempting to cross it on foot in summer are walking into temperatures that kill the healthy in hours. In a single recent summer, 12 people died of heat near El Paso alone. Many more died just across the state line. And the danger is not only for those crossing. In one border county, in another single deadly period, 11 longtime residents between the ages of 60 and 80 died of heat, most of them, tellingly, in homes that had no air conditioning at all. On the border, poverty, heat, and a lack of cooling combine into some of the highest heat death rates in the state. And layered on top of all of that is the geography we covered in Part 2, the urban heat island, which ensures that within every Texas city, the poorest and least shaded neighborhoods run hottest. So the map of who dies in these record summers, in Texas as everywhere, tracks with brutal precision the map of who has the least money, the least shade, the least reliable power, the least ability to demand protection, and the least voice to complain when protection is taken away. The heat is universal. The dying is not. Now here is the paradox that sits at the very center of the Texas heat crisis. The thing that makes it so strange and so revealing. Through all of this, the record heat, the strained and once collapsed grid, the deadly summers, the draining aquifers, the soaring insurance, Texas is booming. It is one of the fastest growing states in the entire country, adding people faster than almost anywhere. Individuals and enormous companies are pouring into it by the hundreds of thousands, drawn by its economy, its jobs, its lower cost of living, its lack of a state income tax, and, in a genuine irony, its cheap and abundant energy. The cities are sprawling ever outward across the hot plains. New subdivisions, new office parks, new data centers, all of it adding more people who need to be cooled, more demand on the fragile grid, more strain on the shrinking water supply, and more heat-absorbing concrete to the urban heat islands, in exactly the place and at exactly the time that the summers are becoming more dangerous. And the state's politics have, for the most part, run in the opposite direction from the physical reality of the crisis. Texas leads the entire nation in the solar and battery power that is, right now, keeping its grid alive through these record summers. And yet, its lawmakers have repeatedly tried to pass bills to restrict that very industry. The state stripped away local heat protections for its outdoor workers. It has resisted, session after session, funding air conditioning for its prisons, even while sitting on a historic budget surplus. And it tends, at the level of official policy, to avoid framing any of this in terms of a changing climate at all. So you have a genuinely remarkable situation. Unique in its scale, the largest and fastest growing test case in America for whether a modern society can survive a rapidly heating future, running toward that future at full throttle, while in several concrete ways dismantling or refusing to build the very tools that could help its most vulnerable people survive it. So let me be clear and fair about where all of this leaves us. Because the honest picture is not the simplest, darkest doom story, and you deserve the accurate one, not a scary one. Texas is not going to become unlivable next summer. It is not going to empty out. Air conditioning makes the heat genuinely survivable for the large majority of Texans, and the state has enormous wealth, enormous energy resources, and enormous engineering capacity to throw at this problem. And it is, in real and important ways, already adapting. The extraordinary build-out of solar power and battery storage has so far kept the grid ahead of the relentlessly rising summer demand, which is a real and badly underappreciated success story, and one that is happening in a deeply conservative state largely because it makes economic sense. After Winter Storm Uri, the state did pass new weatherization requirements, imperfect as they are. Cities are mapping their heat islands, planting trees, and opening cooling centers, and some have hired dedicated heat officials to coordinate the response. The federal lawsuit may finally force air conditioning into the prisons. These things are real, they matter, and they are working, for most people, most of the time. But that, in the end, is exactly the point, and it is the honest heart of this entire story. The Texas heat crisis is not really a question of whether the state as a whole survives, because the state as a whole, the wealthy, the comfortable, the well-housed, the people behind good insulation and reliable power and mature shade trees, will very largely adapt and be fine. The crisis is about the widening gap between those people and everyone else. It is about the prisoner in the 110-degree cell lying on the concrete floor. It is about the roofer with no mandated water break on a 115-degree afternoon. It is about the elderly widow who cannot afford to run the air conditioner she owns, or the homeowner priced out of insurance she is required to carry. It is about the family that died in the dark after the hurricane took the power. It is about the migrant in the desert and the child in the unshaded, historically neglected neighborhood that runs 12 degrees hotter than the leafy part of the same city. The heat is getting worse every single summer for all of them. But they are the ones who pay for it, in bodies, first and worst. In Texas, extreme heat has become as much a policy problem as a weather problem, a question not just of how hot it gets, but of whom the state chooses to keep cool when it does, and whom it chooses to leave in the heat. So picture it all at once, this Texas summer, happening right now as you watch this. On a wall of screens at the grid operator's headquarters in Austin, a number ticks up to a new all-time record and holds as thousands of megawatts of solar farms and battery banks strain to keep the lights on across an entire self-contained electrical island. In a Houston apartment, a single-window air conditioning unit hums against a 106-degree afternoon and a 112-degree heat index doing its job, for now, for exactly as long as the power holds. In a prison cell, a couple of 100 miles inland, with no air conditioning at all, and the temperature well past 110. A man soaks a towel in his sink and lies down on the bare concrete floor to survive the afternoon. On a construction site, A crew works through the worst heat of the day with no break mandated by any law, trusting that their particular boss, today, will let them stop for water. Out on the far western edge of the state, someone is walking through the desert with an empty bottle. In a kitchen somewhere, a family opens an insurance renewal and does the math again. And somewhere, in a filing cabinet in a state office, sits a climate report projecting that within about a decade, a typical ordinary Texas year will be hotter than almost any year the state has ever recorded in its history. All of that is one state, in one summer. And every one of those summers, now, is hotter than the one before it. Texas built a great civilization in one of the hottest corners of America, and it made that civilization livable with two things, and only two things: cheap, abundant power, and the unspoken bedrock assumption that both the power and the climate would always hold. The heat is now testing that assumption every single year, and it is testing it harder each time. The machines are still running. The grid, for now, is still holding. The trees are still, in the wealthy parts of town, still providing shade. But the question Texas